people sometimes ask me where my name is from, and it's one of the great conundrums in the family history and lore. We're not really sure where we're from, but sometimes I like to fashion myself as Italian. Because I somehow think I could pull it off, and probably moments of delusion. But then today they actually printed out my name here, and they actually made me Italian. So and your relative. Yeah. So there we go. So I might this might stick. That happened by accident, but it's all good fun. I think I might have taken Robert's talk too seriously yesterday because I was thinking, sovereignty and certainly far from a sovereign, but a co-head of this panel. So how do I flex that? So I have to make some exceptions, I think. So I'm making some exceptions in that the topic has sort of, I keep on making exceptions. It's sort of changed, and the title has changed. And I'm not pardoning anybody, okay? No pardons, only pardoning myself. But I'm making some exceptions here. And as you'll see, the topic in the handout, there's a title. I'm actually going to rename this talk. I'm not sure its substance is going to be that great. I hope it will be. But I want at least a good title. So, the bad man theory of religious law. I think that's going to be the title. I think it's a good enough title, and I actually have to come up with a good body now. So the bad man theory of religious law. Of course, I'm ripping on Oliver Wendell Holmes' bad man theory of law, although by that he means a predictive idea. I don't mean it in a predictive sense. But the idea here is to think about religious law from, or Jewish law, from the specter of one who violates the law. Because I think that is a window into the sort of subtle relationship between law and religion that exists in religious legal traditions like Jewish law. How do we look at the one who violates the law? Is the one who violates the law also doing a religious sin or even more? So this basic idea is an idea I think that's well known to scholars of biblical law and Jewish law. I always enjoy the formulations of Moshe Greenberg's timeless article, although there's certainly been some responses to the article, but some of those basic insights seem very powerful. So here I have on the source sheet some just an excerpted quote from Greenberg's Some Postulates of Biblical Criminal Law. And he says the following: in the biblical theory, the idea of the transcendence of the law receives a more thoroughgoing expression. There is a distinctly religious tone here, fundamentally different in quality from the political benefits guaranteed in the cuneiform law collections, right? This contrast, of course, is ancient Near Eastern law, Mesopotamian law. So he wants to say biblical law is religious law. And then he adds, in the sphere of the criminal law, the effect of this divine authorship of all law is to make crimes sins, violations of the will of God. And that very pithy formulation is obviously critical, and it's an entryway into understanding the Pentateuch and the hidden status of law within the Torah. That within the Torah, a violation, his focus here is on criminal law, but of course we could make it, certainly I think we should formulate it more generally, that violation of law is a sin against God. So what I want to try to do is to take that basic insight and explore it and think about it and meditate on it through text. That's really the idea of my presentation today. And I really do need feedback here as I'm working on it towards a paper and an article. He cites, and I want to do it through two main sort of texts or topics. One's more a text, the other is a topic. He cites a source text right here, Numbers 15, verse 30. And he cites it as supporting his proposition that in the Bible, a violation is a sin against God. And the truth is, if you look at the verse, it's actually even more dramatic than that. If anything, Greenberg's understating. So let's see Numbers 15 and really try to focus on our main set of verses towards the end, but I brought the entire section over here. Numbers 15 is a section of Numbers that talks about what happens if somebody violates the law. And it sets it up with the pericope has two different parts to it, opposing one scenario to another scenario. So the first scenario, let's just read a little bit, but if you unintentionally, and the root there is shogeg, if you unintentionally fail to observe all these commandments that the Lord has spoken to Moses, everything that the Lord has commanded you by Moses from the day the Lord gave you commandments and thereafter throughout the generations, then if it was done unintentionally, you bring various sacrifices. Verse 27 is sort of a subunit of this, where it talks about an individual who sins unintentionally. So they too, so apparently the first part is the collective, and then the second part is the individual, but all this is what I'm calling part A of the pericope. Unintentional sin. So whether it's collective or individual, there are sacrifices that must be brought to atone. Then we have the part B of the pericope. But whoever acts high-handedly, and here the Hebrew is biad ramah, whether a native or an alien, affronts the Lord, and shall be cut off from among the people, because of having despised the word of the Lord and broken his commandment. Such a person shall be utterly cut off and bear the guilt. And in the original, it's using very loaded terminology. Megadef, right? Sometimes the translation is not capturing the full brunt of the original, affronting the Lord. It's actually cursing the Lord, right? And being cut off, repeated more than once here. And then the line that Dvar Adonai Biza, the word of the Lord, he has despised the word of the Lord. He has broken or annulled, violated the Lord's commandment. Very, very striking terminology. Now, what's remarkable when one just focuses on this text, where a plain set of eyes here is helpful, is what has the person done wrong? Well, it uses the terminology biyad ramah. Yad ramah is an expression that appears elsewhere in the Torah. Sometimes maybe it has the sense of visibly, but I think here it's hard to escape that it's being opposed to the first set of verses. The first set of verses is accidental violation of law. So here, what's going on in verse 30 and 31 is deliberate violation of law. So then deliberate violation of law, now we have to up the ante, actually, from what Greenberg said. At least over here, deliberate violation of law is not just a sin. It's cursing God. It's despising the word of God. It warrants being cut off. So far, the plain text of the Bible. Now, what I want to do still in this sort of first part, where I'm going to take a little bit more time in this first part, is to look at two post-biblical treatments of this text. One is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a very famous scroll, 1QS, or the Rule of the Community. The Rule of the Community is a sectarian document of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is describing the rules, the protocols, the guidelines of the sectarian community in Qumran. And in a passage that's received much scholarly attention, we read the following section. So I brought here from 1QS has a complicated and complex redaction history, so what the exact relationships of its various parts are, it gets a little tricky to figure out, and there are all sorts of hypotheses and there are different recensions. So any one passage might or might not be linked in direct or indirect ways to other passages. But this is one passage which clearly is a unit. And that's what I have here on source 3a. Now I'm on page 1, Roman numeral 8. So let's just read a bit together. These are the regulations by which the men of perfect holiness shall conduct themselves one with another. So these are regulations for the men of perfect holiness, right? The context is within the sectarian community, how they shall conduct themselves, the men of perfect holiness. All who enter the council of holiness. And here we see again the language of the collective here, the council, of those walking in perfect behavior as he commanded. Perfect behavior. Any one of them who breaks a word of the law of Moses impertinently, and here it is a citation of those biblical words, biyad ramah, or through carelessness, will be banished from the community council and shall not return. Then in the continuation, which I just brought a little bit, it talks about what happens if the person did not act, did not break the word biyad ramah, but rather through an accidental oversight, bishgaga, then there's not complete banishment from the community, but rather one is exiled, as it were, from the community for a period of time, and then one can be reintegrated into the community. So what we see here is the same binary, and if you saw it in the original, it's unmistakable that it's using the same terminology as we find in Numbers 15. It's inverting the order, right? It's beginning with the case of deliberate sin, and then turning to the case of accidental sin. And here we see that several things. The first thing we see in this Qumran text is that it takes the biblical text of Numbers 15 literally. Right? What did the person do in Numbers 15, verse 30? According to the community rule, what the person did is deliberately violating a commandment. Any commandment that's deliberately violated, that falls under Numbers 15:30. So the first thing is just an affirmation of that very striking, plain sense. That's the way it was received in this Second Temple text that's dated some period to 2nd century BC, something like that loosely. So this text, a very early interpretation of Numbers 15, understands it literally. But then it actually intensifies it further or adapts it in two other ways, I would say, most basically. It puts it within a communal framing, right? Even the individual who sins, we should encounter that individual sin within the communal, and it's a council. I would use the language, although it doesn't appear here, but it appears enough elsewhere throughout this scroll that I think it's fair, a covenantal community. So the sectarian community is a covenantal community which is bound by complete commitment to upholding the law. And therefore, any individual who deliberately violates even one commandment, right, has betrayed or violated the covenant of the community. And therefore, that community cannot house such a person. There's a need both for not just a punishment for the individual, that too, but also the community to have a clean slate, to be a community of the perfect, not to house within them somebody who is a offender, sinner, curser of God, violator of the covenantal community and its standard. Of course, the other critical change here is that it's not God who cuts off the violator or sinner. It's the community who banishes the violator, sinner, offender, right? Transgressor. I don't know, we have that out of the language, right? It's the community who responds. So It could be, some scholars also posit that maybe God also has a secondary or a heightened role also in punishing the sinner, but that's not the focus of this passage, right? What the passage has done, it's rephrased and reframed the verses to say that somebody who is a violator is a sinner and the community responds. I would actually reformulate that as follows. The community responds through legal protocol. Okay, what I'm trying to do a little bit is meditate here on the relationship, oh wow, we don't have a lot of time here, so I got to go drop faster, of law and religion. So in the relationship of law and religion, what I'm saying here is that law is so fundamental to being devout to God and being a part of the religious community, that any single violation of law, right, is a ultimate sin against God, and it is grounds for being expelled from the covenantal community. But the way we respond to it is through legal mechanism. So we're entirely in a world of law. Okay, the stakes of law is the ultimate stakes one could imagine. I don't think we could imagine a community this committed to law, that one single deliberate offense means you can't be tolerated within this community. And then the response to it is also a response through legal mechanism of investigation, obviously, adjudication, and then banishing the person from the community. Now, I think this all takes on much more meaning against or juxtaposed to the Rabbinic text. So even though I'm short on time, I've got to at least see the Rabbinic text together. Here we have on page 2 on the bottom. Page 2 on the bottom, we have the rabbis in the Midrash Halacha and the Sifrei. And you see everybody with me together, please, 5a. So the rabbis are commenting on the same verse. Here they're actually beginning in the first part of the parakot, but I think it extends to the entire parakot what they're saying. And they have certain reflections of this Qumran understanding, but then go in a very, very different direction. So let's read a little bit together here. But if you unintentionally fail to observe all these commandments, Scripture here speaks of idolatry. You say idolatry, but perhaps it speaks of transgressing all the mitzvot. So in other words, in the rabbinic understanding, they're going to say this verse, what curses God? It's actually idolatry. But then they say, maybe it's not idolatry, maybe it's violating all the commandments. Then in the continuation, they say, you say it's idolatry, but perhaps it is any of the commandments? And then they say, no, it refers to idolatry. And then in the continuation, look at the language here. Just as one who transgresses all the mitzvot, all the commandments, divests himself of the yoke, porek all, breaks the covenant, mefer brit, and interesting, the language of covenant surfaces, and reveals the Torah, megale panim b'Torah, exposes the Torah, so he who transgresses one mitzvah does the same. What's going to be that one mitzvah? Idolatry. Let me just briefly explain. In this one loaded passage, you have the way the rabbis are going to go, but an awareness of alternate routes. The alternate routes are very similar to the Qumran routes. It's a covenantal language. They entertain, they understand that the plain sense of the verse is even transgressing one commandment is cursing God, is a violation of the covenant, is actually that threefold formulation. Mefer brit, porek all, megale panim, the threefold formulation that I have here of breaking the covenant, etc. That can even be done through violating one commandment. But the rabbis cannot accept that. So then they ratchet it up to the next level. Well, maybe it's not violating one commandment, it's violating all commandments. Then the rabbis say, well, what's the equivalent of violating all commandments? Violating idolatry. Now, idolatry has an interesting role here, because on the one hand, we could formulate idolatry as a cardinal commandment, the cardinal commandment, but we also can move beyond the language of commandment. We could view it as the ultimate sin of religion, idolatry. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that the rabbis, as legalistic as they are confronting a problem. And the problem is how to take law as the sole mechanism of expression of religiosity, and to deal with its stakes and its implications. And the rabbis actually hesitate and draw back. Cursing God is not violating one law. Cursing God would be violating all laws, which maybe we should reformulate as a rejection of all laws. Then the rabbis say, cursing God is actually cursing God. It's idolatry. So of course you need to have religious commitment and religious observance. I'm going to just need 2 more minutes here. You're going to, of course, need to do that, but that's not the test of ultimate religiosity. So here we have a cleavage that's emerging, a breaking away of legalism, and yet there's a level of religiosity that is being formulated and defined distinct from legalism in its purest sense. I would just gesture and point briefly to 2 things. It's really fascinating, if you go with this, to look in the Tosefta on page 4.8c. Okay, page 4.8c. I'm just going to briefly point to 2 last texts and leave it at that. On page 4.8c, there's 12.9. It says, to these they added. Now these meaning, there's a list in the Mishnah of those who forfeit their share to the world to come. So 12.9 says, to these they added, they who break the yoke, violate the covenant, or misinterpret the law, megaleh panim. So does everybody recognize it's a little hard to follow it in the English, but that's our same threefold list, right? Mefer brit, porekol, mefer brit, and megaleh panim. Those are added to the list of people who don't have a share in the world to come. Notice what happened here. At this point, there's a distinct status of porekol, mefer brit, megaleh panim. If you remember in the Rabbinic Midrash, violating all laws was the definition of porekol. Who is the one who releases himself from the burden? It's one who violates all the commandments. That's in the Rabbinic Midrash. But here there's a distinct individual, a status of a sinner who, not through legal offenses, he has released himself of the burden. He has violated covenant. He has exposed the Torah in its wrong fashion. And notice the response, how different it is from Qumran. The response is a purely religious response. You lose your share in the world to come. We transcended the sphere of legalism and entered a sphere of religiosity. Of course, they're not in contradiction, but it's a distinct sphere. The last thing I'll just say, because I'm out of time, is back on page 3, if you continue to look in the Rabbinic Midrash, on page 3 you have other examples of who is the candidate for Numbers 15:30. Who is the one who violates Biyad Ramah? And I think the list now becomes really interesting. Some of them are more legalistic, some of them are more religious, some of them are religious personalities. Maybe somebody who doesn't circumcise. Maybe somebody who is an apikores. Maybe somebody who is a Sadducee. So we've moved very far from the world of strict legalism to a certain identity. In other words, from violation to sin to sinner. That's what I think emerges here in this passage. So I'm out of time, but the basic idea here is to explore that idea that violation is sin and violation is cursing God, and then to see what happens if you take that seriously. In the Qumran world, they take it really seriously, and they actually go even further with its legalism. In the Rabbinic world, I'm saying they pivot the other direction. And while they're aware of that possibility, instead they start to formulate a sphere of religiosity that's distinct from legalism. The part I didn't get to talk about is, I think the term rasha is also related to this. Does that mean guilty or does that mean sinner? And I think it has an interesting history in the Bible, in Qumran, and in rabbinic literature.